All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It's Thursday, April 14th of 2022. I hope your two-game early slate MLB lineups are doing okay. If you're playing the early slate, I skipped that one today here. And hope your RBC Heritage golf lineups are off to a good start. Quite a high-scoring first round here, at least from those guys at the top here. I think one of my most highest exposed golfers on this week is Cantlay. And he's having a pretty decent first round. I think he's tied for second right now. So off to a decent start. But we've got a couple questions in our queue here for today. 6-gamer on tap here on DraftKings. I think it's an 8-gamer on FanDuel. So one thing to look out for if you're playing baseball DFS tonight, pay attention. Different lock times. FanDuel has the 6:35 games on the slate. It's an 8-game slate. DraftKings does not. Starts at 7:05. It's a 6-game slate. So do not miss that FanDuel lock if you are asleep at the wheel or not paying attention or whatever. We got a couple questions in our queue here for today. Not too many, all things considered. So if you got questions for me, fire them away now. Get them into the queue. I'm going to start here with a question from Ronnie. I think it's a really good way to start the stream. And then from there, we'll kind of pick up and hit some of these questions in roughly chronological order as best I can here. From Ronnie, first question. If you upload your own projections, how does that affect higher sim variance? Does SaberSim still take into account its own projected sim percentiles? So let's talk about this real quick. Let's say you're looking at the pitcher percentiles here or whatever, and you think, you know what? Not sure I like Musgrove as the best projected pitcher on the slate against the Braves, and you take him down a point, right? So we've lowered his projection by 1 fantasy point at the average. What impact does that have? Well, on his entire range of outcomes, we will lower the fantasy point production, the output of Musgrove in every single simulation by 1 point. It has the impact. Another way of kind of thinking about this is it basically has the impact of taking his entire distribution, his entire range of outcomes here, and moving it 1 point to the left. Right? 1 point less across the entire distribution. So you still get to take advantage of the simulations when you build your lineups in terms of how that affects sim variance, right? It doesn't necessarily directly affect sim variance. Sim variance determines how big the bucket of simulations are when we go to build your lineups. So what would happen here is if you went in to build your lineups for a 20 max, 10 to 50K, we will take a relatively small bucket of sims on each individual lineup. Only now, every Joe Musgrove simulation that gets pulled here, what he scored in that set of sims is 1 point less than what he had done before. Simple as that. So very useful to make custom projections adjustments as you see fit, really. But I guess more importantly, you are still taking advantage of the full value of the simulations, the full distributions for different players, etc. I think one thing just to kind of note on this, where like it can be kind of important to just have this in the back of your mind that this is happening. You know, if we take something like MMA, and let me see if we don't have sims yet for MMA. I think golf is actually a decent example as well. So let me go ahead and jump over here. Okay, so, for golf, for example, right, we have these kind of unique distributions. You've got the missed cut distributions here, and then a big like make cut and also all the win equity over here, right? If you were to say, I really want a lot of Cameron Smith, I really like Cameron Smith on this week or something, and you bumped him to like, I don't know, 90.29, right? The one thing to just note is that's shifting this entire distribution over, right? So this kind of gets a little bit into the weeds. I don't think this is something that you need to stress about too much, but you'll be taking like his 140 fantasy point outcomes, like his super high end ceiling outcomes, and shifting those over by 6 points. And even the miscut outcomes are going to be shifted over a little bit here as well. All of this is to say is that I would say, in sports where if you click a player and you do not see a normal distribution, you do not see something that resembles a bell curve, to just remember that this does have that impact of shifting that entire distribution over. And it can make, in particular, the top ends or the bottom ends sometimes a little bit too high or too low. I guess all of this is really to say is that, if you're adjusting projections, making adjustments to custom projections, I'm not trying to scare anybody off. I think it's a great way to add value, but start small, right? I guess really that's the practical impact, is that for certain sports, making an adjustment to a custom projection may do more than you might expect based on what intuitively that adjustment kind of feels like to you on step one. I noticed it really in particular for MMA last week. I was playing around with projections. I was doing some research builds, kind of deciding how I wanted to tackle the slate. I ended up adjusting some projections for different fighters for MMA. And for even fighters where I did not make a huge adjustment, it had like a massive impact on how much exposure I got to those guys in step three because of the way that the outcomes look. Because of basically I was taking like the early round finishing sims and bumping them up by like 10 points. So they were showing up in like every lineup. It was actually, I think probably a better way of looking at it is I was basically taking like win by decision outcomes in the simulations and making them appear to the builder as if they were finishing outcomes. And it was just giving me a ton of these fighters. So anyway, in summary, still get to take advantage of the distributions and the simulations when you make adjustments to custom projections. I think adjusting custom projections is a great way to add value as you see fit in virtually any sport, but take a light touch when you're first getting started out and see what the impact is of some minor adjustments before going too ham on it. So good first question to get us started at here today. We'll jump back, hit a question here from Will about the sliders. He said, question about different max entry sizes for tournaments that have a 10 entry max. Is it recommended to have the Saber slider set on 20 max and then have it build out less teams, or set on the 3 max and build out more? Short answer, either is probably fine. They are the difference in the couple notches of sliders is not going to have such a significant impact on your lineups that I would worry about it. An alternative as well would be to pick something kind of in the middle. So, you can see 3 max, 756, 20 max is 767. So you could do, something like this or something like this. These little like 1 or 2 notch changes don't end up having a huge impact. I think it's perfectly fine to kind of just use either. I also think it's fine to just look at what the sliders actually kind of are and what they say and ask yourself, how do you want to handle the slate? Right? Do you want to pick the 20 max sliders will lead you to play a little more of a higher variance, slightly more of a higher ownership faded strategy. Maybe if it's a top heavier tournament, maybe you want to do that. If it's a flatter tournament, right? Flat payout structure, not as financially incentivized to shooting for a super high upside outcome. Maybe you take the 3 max sliders and play a little bit safer. I think that's a good way to do it too. So, but you're not going to get bad lineups for that contest with either of those sliders. Interesting one from Neil here. How do you approach Angel stacks on days Ohtani is pitching? It's brutal that Ohtani isn't available as both a pitcher and a hitter. After Ohtani and Trout, the lineup falls off a cliff. Do you just let the builder do its thing, or is this a spot where you look to make manual adjustments? Yeah, it's super annoying, isn't it? I don't do anything manual here to account for this, right? It ultimately what's going to happen here is that we'll build your lineups for the Angel stacks just as we do with every other team, and if the builder finds that for that set of simulations, a Angels stack of the remaining 8 players that are available to use is optimal or viable, actually I guess in that case really optimal, it will use them. And I typically kind of let my exposure to Angel stacks on these days work out the way it does. Certainly is unfortunate. I don't know what the right answer is. I have had some of my own thoughts here. I feel like having two different Ohtanis, one that you can use at pitcher and one that you can use at hitter, makes some sense to me, at least intuitively. But I feel like from a data side, that's really painful to navigate. I don't even know exactly. I don't know. It'd get kind of weird pretty fast. I get why it is the way it is, but it also feels a little lazy on the site's part. I don't know. Either way, from a practical standpoint, from the DFS side, it's not something that I really worry about. It's something that everybody has to deal with, right? So not something that I worry about in terms of making a manual adjustment. So, but good question. I do think they are, just from pure theory, I think they're a little less stackable in a situation like this, right? And that's just the way it is. So, Reed asked the question. We'll talk about this one kind of quickly here. But for those of you that were unaware, we did have a little bit of some site issues here. Approaching NBA lock yesterday, our wonderful support team was kind of quick to address that, and our back-end team working on the site here got everything back stable very quickly. I think all things considered, it was like a 5-minute ordeal, but very unfortunate timing with that 5-minute outage there. That issue is resolved on our end. We had an increased database load right before lock here, and that issue is resolved on our end, and we don't expect it to happen again. So again, I apologize to everybody that was affected by that last night, but wanted to address that since there was a question here. So okay, and then a good follow-up here from I think it's Dark Knight, I think is actually how this is pronounced. Kind of a clever spelling there, but he said, you mentioned in yesterday's office hours that you typically don't do any player pool curation, but I know you've mentioned in the past that you do this for golf. Have you changed your stance on this, or is that something you still do? Thanks. I haven't been doing it as much. I don't know how much value it was adding, to be totally honest. I certainly, I don't think, let me put it this way. I don't think it is hurting you to do this. I don't think it is suboptimal. I just don't know if I was like getting a lot out of it in particular. So yeah, I mentioned, I think in some of my older golf content, that one thing I like to do is curate a golf pool, mostly just by trimming off guys that had a low overall percent chance to make the cut, or a low overall percent chance to top 10 in the Sims or something like that. And again, I think it maybe gives you overall a safer pool of golfers from which to work. But the realization I kind of came to is that, you know, these numbers themselves come from the simulations, and they are the same simulations that ultimately are used to build your lineups. So I don't know, like, if you are basically, the Sims are already kind of taking into account that, you know, I don't know, James Hahn only has a 40% chance to make the cut. If you get a James Hahn lineup, it's clearly one where he made the cut. And at 6,000 salary, virtually all he has to do to make that lineup profitable is probably make the cut. So, yeah, I haven't been doing it as much. I don't think if you watched my content and kind of have started doing that yourself and you enjoy doing it, and I wouldn't talk you out of it. I just don't know how much value it was adding for me in particular. The one thing I'll kind of note here, I guess part of the reason why I've also started doing this as well, is I think when you build for large field GPPs with SaberSim, you get like this moderate 3 to 4 ownership fade. I do think ownership is a big edge in golf. I think it's an important thing to look at, but I do feel like especially when it starts to get up to like 4, it can kind of over promote some of these these very low owned, low salary guys, which I think is kind of how I got down the path of trimming them out of my pool completely, to basically force the builder to make more ownership decisions based on guys that have an overall higher upside, instead of just picking the guy that's like 0.5% owned. If you are going to build with the default settings and kind of just build like this and allow the ownership fade slider to kind of make your ownership decisions for you, I still think some player pool curation is a good idea. What I have instead kind of transitioned to is letting my player pool be a little more open, and building, you know, a lot of times I've been using the 0-10 settings, which just lets you get single tournament optimals. Like, you'll get 1,500 single tournament optimals. And I've been doing a lot of my ownership adjustments either in the form of adjusting projections. So I will just take the projections. I will lower the projections of certain golfers to guys that I think are going to be a little higher owned, or I'll just cap my exposure in step 3 a little bit more. Just kind of a different thing that I've been doing a little bit this season. There's a lot of different ways to go about this, right? I think what I was doing around this time last year was curating a player pool by lowering some of these low make cut guys and then letting ownership fade as the slider kind of determine how to handle ownership. And I think that's good. I think that's probably a better place to start if you're a beginner to golf DFS. But as you know, this past year has gone on, I've adjusted a little bit more to wanting a little bit more. Basically, this is a control thing. I've wanted a little bit more hands-on control over how I'm navigating the chalk in golf. So I've adjusted to the strategy where I leave my pool more open. leave ownership fade a little bit lower, and I kind of make my own decisions on the way that I'm making an adjustment based on ownership. On that note, I'm going to hit this question real quick just since I saw it. Sloaner said, pretty new to DFS and finding it hard to get an edge in golf DFS. Any strategies you can suggest? I had a good ROI in NBA with late swap and these high correlation sports with stacking, but no luck in golf yet. I will openly say very confidently that golf is a much, much harder sport to get a reliable edge in. There is no correlation apart from very occasionally you'll get such a significant weather split that you can kind of correlate your lineups by stacking tee times, but that's not by any means anything close to reliable. I think the main edge to golf really is an ownership thing. I think some of the highest value things you can do in your golf process before I would even go and research golfers, I would go and try to see if you can get an idea, if you can add value to the ownership projections. Typically there is, okay, I'll kind of show you the way I kind of think about golf DFS overall is basically, so I like to run these research builds, right? I stick to these pretty frequently. So I will take 1,500 single tournament simulations, basically. I'm simulating the tournament 1,500 times doing this, and I like to look at how often certain golfers show up as optimal. And you will find that on almost any given individual tournament, the top end golfer overall in the field probably has like between a 20 to a max 25% chance to show up in the winning lineup, right? So I feel like one of the bigger edges that you can get in golf overall is to figure out what are those guys that are going to be higher owned over the field than their raw chance of being optimal, and get under the field on those guys and build lineups that kind of directly leverage against that ownership. But you're not going to be talking about massive inefficiencies here, right? Like if there's a guy that's going to get to 30% owned that you think has a 20% chance to be in the optimal lineup, that's probably about as big as the edge gets. And it is a much smaller impact than a player who becomes an 8. Okay, so here's a good example. For this particular event, 17% chance of the highest percent golfer showing up in the optimal lineup. I think the highest owned guy on the slate is like, I think Morikawa's like 25. There's maybe a potential edge, right? And we projected him lower. We projected him closer to his optimal value. Doing some research to figure out where the field is going to go, to figure out what those edges are going to be, I think is some of the highest value research you can do in golf DFS. What was I saying? In NBA, right? You get the starting point guard that the news broke after lock, and he should be 45% owned, and he's like 9% owned, right? After lock. That's a huge edge. Like that's what we're kind of comparing against here. So when it comes to golf DFS in particular, I think some of the best value that you can add is making sure that you are leveraging against ownership. On that note, we are working on our ownership models for all sports now at the moment. And I think I would love to be able to say 1 year from now that you don't even really need to spend time doing that because our ownership model is so dialed in. I think at the moment where we are, I think some of the best value adds you can do is identifying, even in particular, what are those guys that are going to get up to 25% ownership, because it is probably to the optimal strategy to fade them. And play less bankroll, to be honest, right? Like, I think that's just a very good idea. If you're playing 5% in NBA, there are good big golf contests that you can play and play 1% of your equivalent bankroll as you're getting familiar, but it is definitely a lower edge sport. And I think if you're going to grind golf DFS, you kind of have to love it a little bit, because I think it's a harder sport. It's a harder sport for me to come up here on stream and say, do this, and I feel very confident that you will get an edge. So that's kind of where I'd leave that, but I love it. I think it's fun. I think it's one of the most fun sweats. I think it's one of the most fun kind of game theory problems. But when I'm talking about, I get excited. I'm like, that guy was 10% over-owned when we flip the cards over and the slate starts. Like, I've got a little bit of an edge this week. I mean, in NBA with late swap, again, you get like 30% ownership inefficiencies. So Brad said, I guess what my question would be, if he were to worry about not binking, could he play viable lines daily with zero ownership fade? Oh, whoops. Okay. This is all right. I'll come back to that, Brad. I realized that was like the third part of your question here. I thought that was directly related to my what we were just talking about here. Okay. I am going to first hit, I'm going to walk through the questions that came in through the start of the stream, and maybe it will just be Brad's question here first. Oh, Eamon had a question here. I said, would you say DFS is becoming more difficult? It seems like MLB, it feels very hard to bank nowadays. Yeah, it is. I feel pretty confident saying that. Tools are continuing to get better. Projections are continuing to get better. Content continues to get better. The rake, we haven't had a rake jump in a while, but the rake is pretty high. You're beating at the low stakes, you're trying to beat 15, 16% now. Yeah, it's getting tougher. I feel very confident that, in most of these sports here, there is still a very reliable edge. But I do think it has gotten tougher. But I mean, all it really takes is that NBA slate where you see how few people late swap onto the new elite play, or you go and do some digging onto your MLB contests and see how few people are stacking. And then you look at the people who are stacking and how many of them are just clearly just forcing a stacking rule in to always stack the same way and stack 1 through 5 every time. And how owned some team with, I don't know how over-owned Coors might be tonight. Not to say that it's necessarily wrong or right to be over or under the field, but I don't know. I guess maybe I am saying I think Coors is going to be over-owned tonight. I guess is the point I'm making. Yeah, I think it's getting harder, but I think it's definitely still a beatable game. Dynastic Vision said, when should I plus up the lineups ran by the sim during GPP games, or do I always keep it at 500? Is it when the entry pool is big? Good question. I think 500, you are going to be fine virtually all the time. There are, I think, like 2 situations where I would consider increasing it. The first is, I guess the first is like, if you are building and making a lot of adjustments in step 3, or if you're building and you're getting the error in step 3 that says you need to build more lineups, then you should go and build with a larger pool. I also would say, for me personally, every time I build 150 lineups, I increase this up to 1,500, just because it lets me have more lineups to work with. It makes sure that those 150 are a better set of 1,500. I've mentioned here to the team a couple times here that I think we should just increase this I think we should just make this the default value for 150 maxes. That may or may not be something we do, but I would say, you'll be fine at 500 virtually all the time. But if you're playing 150, I would increase it and just build 1,500. Or if you're running into issues in step 3 to make the adjustments you want to make, then it's also a good opportunity to increase it. But 500 is fine for, I would say, like 90% of cases. And of course, if you don't have time, don't build 1,500 lineups. If you're really close up against lock running late, stick with the 500. All right, so now we get to this question from Brad here. So I was talking with a friend about SaberSim and explaining sliders, and he brought up a point how he wouldn't be interested in ownership fade as he isn't concerned with binking, but just getting back a minimum profit for him. He always just slides to 0 and makes a difference. He's thinking about the free trial. I guess my question would be, if you were to not worry about binking, could he play viable lineups daily with 0 ownership fade? This is really 2 different questions, 2 very different, interesting questions. First of all, I would say that your friend is basically just patently wrong about the way that he's approaching GPPs. All of the equity in the contest is up at the high payout positions, right? You are basically, if he's saying he's mostly interested in min cashing, right? The cash line in a GPP is like top 20%. So you have something, you're getting paid 2 to 1 odds on something that has roughly an average 1 in 5 chance of happening, right? And shooting for that outcome. That's not a financially sound strategy. And that is generally true of most of the min cash and the lower cash equity positions in a GPP contest. They are, in theory, I guess, nice to have when a lineup just happens to land there as opposed to not cashing, but typically particularly building to min cash in a GPP is the wrong approach, because the contest is set up in a way that does not financially incentivize that. So I feel very strongly that playing GPPs with a goal of not with a stated goal of not trying to bink and to just min cash the contest just isn't a good use of your time. I don't love cash games. I don't think there's a huge edge in cash games, but it sounds like this person would probably be better suited to going to play cash games where they, at least in theory, are getting better odds for what they're trying to do in the contest, right? That's a contest that says, you're getting 2-to-1 odds on something that has, raw probability, the 4 to 45% chance of happening, I guess. Right. If you're better, if you're better than the competition, then you beat the rake and you win more often than that, and then it's profitable. But that would probably go play cash games if he just wants to min cash. Secondly, it feels like the chat feels passionately about this as well. The second question here is, can you build profitable lineups with zero ownership fade? That is a far more interesting question. And a far more complicated question. And I'm going to say, broadly speaking, very general, yes, right? You can. And you can kind of know that they're profitable just by looking at what else is going on here, right? Turning ownership fade off, what you are still getting out of here is you are still taking individual small buckets of game simulations and building well-correlated lineups around those sims. You basically are just no longer making an attempt to exploit the field for bad ownership decisions. You're saying, like, in a nutshell, take a slate simulation and stack the 2 best teams with the 2 best pitchers for what you can do under the salary cap. I'm confident that's probably still profitable. I would probably say you are not maximizing EV, right, at that point, but that is probably still profitable. That is basically what the ownership fade slider kind of tries to do. It basically says, let's take the sims, let's build correlated lineups that are appropriate for the sport, but then let's also exploit the field. Let's maximize our profit by also taking advantage of the bad decisions that the field is going to make in the form of ownership projections. I think the ownership fade slider gets pretty interesting pretty quickly, especially as you get more familiar with what's it doing. And there are sports where I turn this down because I am doing things on my own in my process to adjust projections or exposure to kind of more adjust ownership more in a hands-on way. I just talked about how I do that for golf. I have been experimenting with that a little bit for baseball as well. I think that's perfectly fine. I think best overall practice, if you don't know what to do, you should leave the ownership fade at the default slider and take advantage of the extra EV you're getting out of that. But it is the slider that I would say in general. And actually, let me make a clear point. If you were asking me, hey, Jordan, would it be better if I just did this? I'm going to tell you no, as I do all the time on this stream. I'm going to say no, play the default sliders that have data-driven backtesting defending them, backing them up why they are where they're at. But if you come to me and say, hey, Jordan, I'm doing a process where I'm running research builds, or I'm doing my own research and I'm adjusting my projections on step 1 to account for ownership, or I want to have really hands-on control over my exposures in step 3, so I'm handling ownership in step 3. Can I turn the ownership fade slider down? I'd probably say, yeah, that's totally fine. Don't worry about that. That makes some sense. In other words, I don't think this is probably the only slider where if you told me in your particular process you were bringing it down, that I would be okay with. I really don't recommend often bringing correlation or sim variance down, because then I think you start to make just straight up worse lineups. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Or even if you ran lineups and you said, wow, this is really aggressively fading ownership, I'm going to turn this down. I think that's also totally fine too. So all of this is to say is that, like, the ownership fade slider is kind of an interesting one just because it's very human dependent. It's like dependent on what people are going to do. Our ownership projections are projections of what human behavior is actually going to look like in a contest, and it gets kind of interesting. I am by no means telling people to blindly just start using less ownership fade, but it is also the one slider that I am most comfortable, if somebody explained their process to me, hearing that down, like throughout the process, that they use less ownership fade. And you can definitely build profitable lineups with ownership fade virtually anywhere. That's not really the case for other sliders. If you were like, hey, Jordan, I'm actually building my MLB sliders with 2 correlation and 2 sim variance, I'd probably do my best I could to talk you out of that. If you told me that you were using the defaults but a lower ownership fade slider, I probably wouldn't be worried by that. So, yeah, and also I'll mention this here too. I don't want to be mean. Brad said no, he isn't. I don't know the full details of what he plays and how much he trades. I was trying to understand if he looked to bank but wasn't interested. Yeah, I'm not trying to. I don't want to be rude or mean or anything. Everybody starts from somewhere, but I mean, I think it is. You can basically pretty quickly explain to somebody why that line of thinking is not profitable by just looking at the probabilities and the payouts of what they're trying to do, right? If anybody trying to min cash is getting paid 2-1 on an event that has a raw probability, right? Raw meaning assuming you have a perfectly average skill level of like approximately 20% of happening, right? You would never take those odds. You would never roll a 5-sided die and try to pick the number, and I'm paying you out 2-1 every time you get it right? I'd play that game, but you shouldn't, right? Or I'd play that game as the dealer, I guess, right? Or as the house, but you shouldn't play that game, right? You're going to lose your money. That's what that person is saying. Like, yeah, I want to play that game. I'm going to pick my 5-sided die, play 2-1 odds on that all day. And that you don't want to do that, right? The money is up top. So you should build lineups that are optimized to those top payout positions. And often that actually comes at the expense of sacrificing min cash equity, which is kind of where you get into this weird cognitive dissonance here, where people will often become better GPP players and suddenly feel like on the day-to-day basis, they're winning less because they have sacrificed min cash equity for top 1% equity, but it takes longer to realize top 1% equity. So they'll say, wait, I thought I was supposed to be getting better. I haven't cashed all week. And it's like, well, yeah, exactly. You were building lineups to cash before in a terrible financial proposition. Now you're building lineups to optimize for top 1%, but it's only been 7 slates. That takes some time to realize. So, yeah, that's. And Neil says min cashes aren't even 2-1 a lot of times. Yeah, they aren't. So, but anyway. Relax with TBJ said, what am I looking to take down a GPP? Do I take the best pitchers or the best batters? Good question. Kind of a broad question here overall. So I'll kind of give you the basics of what you're trying to do in baseball, right? And I mean, it starts, yes, you are trying to take the best pitchers and the best batters, right? Batters in particular have kind of a unique curve here to their ranges of outcomes. So even for very well projected hitters, you'll typically see that they have, Patrick Wisdom, he's playing in Coors Field, which is a really good hitting park here tonight. Most common outcome is 0 points. And you'll have these long tails of ceiling outcomes where they hit like a home run, 2 home runs, that kind of thing. So you're trying to optimize basically to build lineups of hitters where they score these outcomes. Pitchers have a different looking outcome, right? They look a little bit more like a bell curve, but they'll have this very wide distribution where they can score negative points because they get lit up in the first inning, or they can throw a complete game shutout. And then this like big range of outcomes from there, where most of the upside outcomes are pitching with a lot of strikeouts and getting through a lot of innings. So you're trying to build lineups where you've got, guys that can hit the ball and guys that can pitch, right? Where it kind of gets interesting, where you start to build a little bit of an edge here overall, is first from correlation, right? So somewhat unique in baseball is that you have these generally strong correlations between hitters on the same team, right? And because we simulate games at SaberSim, we actually can quantify the exact correlations that a given hitter has. So we know that, this is Patrick Wisdom's range of outcomes, but he's also correlated to all the other hitters on his team. He also has a slight correlation with his starting pitcher. The reason he's correlated with the other hitters on his team is because every time he gets on base, it means the next batter in the order is up, and every other batter in the order is that much closer to their next plate appearance. So because every batter on the team is correlated to one another, it is generally to your benefit to stack teams up, right? So most good GPP lineups that are optimized for upside will have many different players from one team on it. A lot of times so DraftKings, the most players you can take from one team, most hitters you can take from one team is 5, and you pick 8 hitters. So you'll see 5-3 stacks very often. You'll also see 5-2 stacks. You'll see 4-3 stacks, 4-4 stacks, right? Big lineups full of these teams that are stacked up together. So you can basically increase your odds of all the players in your lineup. You're trying to get less right? Because we know that the Cubs are correlated. Instead of trying to pick the individual Cubs that are going to go off along with all the other players in the slate, we can just stack up 5 Cubs and have a lineup that has a better overall chance of success, right? So we generally kind of want to build correlated lineups. The last kind of layer that I would say comes in here is there is a factor of ownership that is important, right? Because we are not just trying to build a raw high-scoring lineup. We are trying to beat other lineups in the contest. So there is a relative value difference between a fantasy point scored by one player and another based on how many lineups in the contest have that player. If Connor Joe scores a fantasy point and he's owned by 20% of the field, right, that fantasy point actually has less value than if, let's pull up some other guy, than if Hunter Dozier scores 1 fantasy point because he's only in 5% of the lineups. That fantasy point is only shared with 5% of the other lineups in the contest. So you are trying to build lineups that have raw, high scoring upside, right? That are correlated and that at least have some kind of are paying some level of attention to the ownership of the players in the contest. I will say the last note, the cherry on top of all of this is that it is not as if we all rush to go play DFS on a given night and all enter the same contest and we're all playing the same game. There are different sized contests. There are also different contests with different payout structures. There are contests where different people can put different numbers of lineups into that contest. And that all affects the optimal strategy, right? If you are playing a contest where you are trying to beat 100,000 other people for a first prize that is 40% of the total payout of the contest, you are financially incentivized to play far more risky, much more high variance strategy because of the way the prizes are awarded for that contest. Whereas if you're playing a contest that is 100 people and first is 5% of the total payouts of that contest, you may not need to take as many risks with the way that you approach your overall lineup. So that's the overall basics. I wanted to start totally from scratch here because this is kind of a wide open question. And I think the practical thing that you were probably now thinking is, okay, great, I get it. Now what? Right? Well, the now what is SaberSim basically tries to automate a lot of this for you. This is not like a money printer. This is not, go in here and bink every night. But we start with game simulations and then leverage the data accordingly for the contest that you are trying to play. So there are a lot of ways to continue to add value here. But broadly speaking, you will get lineups that are very good and appropriate for the contest that you are trying to beat by going in here and building lineups and seeing what they look like. And I actually think it's a very good way to get familiar, right? One of the things that's very hard, if you've approached DFS before and you've tried to hand build or you have tried to work with a traditional optimizer, so much of your time is spent trying to program that tool to build lineups that are constructed the right way, to set the stacking rules to account for things like correlation, to set ownership caps to account for things like ownership. And you never really have that moment of like, okay, I know that these things are correct, so now I can move on to the strategic side of things. You almost never really get the opportunity to do the fun side of DFS, which is like, how do you want to actually tackle the slate, right? SaberSim automates that part for you. So if you're playing, let's say you're just playing 3 lineups tonight. You're playing a 3 max. I know the $3 3 max is one of my favorite contests. So you come in here and you say, I'm playing the $3 3 max, right? 3 max, 10 to 50 or 1,000 to 10,000 entrants. And we'll build you a pool of lineups. And we're actually going to build 500 lineups here, right? That are all viable for the slate tonight. And then you can kind of decide how you want to tackle the slate, right? Maybe you've already done some research and you know what 2 pitchers you want to use. You can adjust your exposures here, and I'll show you how to do that in step 3 and decide what pitchers you want to use. You can decide what stacks you want to use, right? Knowing that the lineups are built the right way that's appropriate for the contest. They're optimized for upside. They're built for the contest. They're built for the slate already. You don't have to worry about all the rules that you're using to make sure you get the constructions. So that is, I guess, and I guess the last thing I'll note on there is if you don't know what to do, the top 3 lineups are going to be perfectly great options for you. But you can kind of continue to iterate here and dial in. Let's just let this build finish up before I wrap this question up. And we'll go on from there. So give this just a second to load here. Cool. So here we go. So DraftKings requires that you make 2 adjustments to projections here to see your lineups. So we can make 2 quick adjustments here to these top guys, and we'll get to start to see some lineups here in just a moment. For those of you that are following Jordan's computer gate this week, right? Aging computers get a little worn out. The parts are starting to arrive. You got some yesterday, you get some today, get some on Saturday. So 2 more streams on the old rig. Next Monday, we should be bright and shiny with our new computers. So pretty excited about that. But anyway, right, we're getting lineups that are correlated and that are, have some mind towards ownership, and we can kind of make adjustments here, right? Maybe you have decided that you're not playing Kevin Gausman, right? I don't know why. Maybe you are. Last year, an outlier. Maybe you think the Yankees offense is underowned, right? So you uncheck him. We'll give you a different set of 3. Work from that. So, okay. Dante said, Jordan, when I sort by actual points after the slate is over to see what kind of lineups and scores I built, does it sort from the entire pool, or does it have to set it to those 150 lineups? Let's go back to yesterday. You can do either, actually. Depends on what you want to do. So if you do actual score, if you sort by actual score, that is the entire pool. That is your entire pool of lineups. There is a toggle that says review mode. And if you click the review mode, that will lock your actual lineup set and sort those by actual score. So it depends on what you want to do, ultimately. So I think this is like a huge build from yesterday. Oh, here we go. Okay, so going in here and sorting actual score is going to sort this entire pool of 500 lineups by the top actual score, right? If we put this back to Saber score here and starting to see the computer slowdowns here. Oh, there we go. Okay. If we turn this back to Saber score and then click review mode, it will basically take your top 20 and sort those by the highest scoring. So we can do that. So it depends on what you're trying to do, basically. So. Brad said, I feel like failing pitchers hurt way more than failing hitters. Lines do not well with a pitcher doing bad. You can still survive with the hitters on 0. No, you can. You could theoretically get by with a hitter scoring 0 as long as the rest of the stack does well. Yeah, you need some success out of your pitchers. I think people hear that and then I don't know what meaningful strategy decisions can come out of that. If you listen to that and said, oh, I'm going to play safer pitchers, I don't know if those actually bring you more safety for the ownership cost you have to pay for them. But I do think that this is just a true statement, broadly speaking, is that, yes, you can survive with the hitter at 0. Says, I need help choosing the right 2 pitchers. Yeah, so that is really what SaberSim will help simplify, right? Because we're not choosing. We're not just looking at the average projections, right? We're actually looking at the success of these pitchers in the simulations that we have for these games, and then helping you decide on what pitchers to use in your lineups based on what contest you are playing. So let's jump back to this build that we just did here a minute ago, and I'll show you a little bit more what I mean. So. Right? I mean, the most basic answer, the fundamental answer is SaberSim is telling you right out of the gate that for this particular build, that for your 3 lineups that you're playing, actually, let's bump this up to 20 and let's assume that you're playing 20 lineups, right? So give this a second here. Okay, so you are getting a pitching pool basically handed to you that has already been adjusted for how they correlate to their own stacks, their ownership, and the contest you are playing. Right? This is the initial way that SaberSim tells you should approach the slate. And it's actually pretty interesting here, right? 20 lineups here, right? Eating some of the chalk, but not crazy over. Kind of an interesting leverage play of using the Cubs pitcher here in 30% of these 20 lineups, right? Some lower owned plays in here, some chalkier plays, right? You don't have to feel you have to go in and choose your pitchers using SaberSim. That part is automated for you. Now, can you go in and do your own research and add value to that and make an adjustment here or manage your risk and say, like, I don't want 60% of a pitcher in my pool? Absolutely. It kind of depends on where can you step in to add value. If you don't really know what pitchers to play, then you don't have to be the one making that decision. If you have done your research and you want to, you can still take advantage of SaberSim to get you halfway there and then make your own adjustments from here. But I literally gone are the days of having to go in and make sure that you've curated your exact player pool and programmed a tool to build the exact kinds of lineups that you want here, because that part is automated for you. So, and if we look here, we can actually, this is just 20 lineups, right? Let's take a quick peek at our full pool of 500, right? You'll actually see that, you know, there are lineups that include a lot of different pitchers, right? There's a lot of different diversity of your pitching pool showing up here. So, anyway. Brad said dual PC setup. Maybe. I've kind of trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the old computer. That's not a bad idea. I don't know. See what I do. But okay, so there were there was that one other question from Edward here in Slack. This will probably be our, actually we still have a little bit of time. Getting to the end of the stream here. So we'll answer this question and then we'll start to look at wrapping up, but we still have about 15 minutes or so. So if you have more questions for me, go ahead and fire away now. Edward said, how often are the player ownership projections updated? I really like to do my exposures by going into the ownership. What I'm trying to get a handle on is when is ownership percentage as good as can be before the initial lock. Thanks for your help. So I believe that ownership rebuilds. It does not rebuild very often throughout the day, just because we don't really commit a ton of resources to doing that before the lineups are out. I believe that ownership rebuilds every time a lineup is confirmed in the final hour before lock. Ownership never updates after lock. Ownership never updates after lock. So I would say, you know, you can probably get good, meaningful value out of ownership any point in the final hour before lock, or any point after all the lineups have been confirmed, right? If all the lineups come out early, at that point, that will be kind of our final ownership projections. Yeah. And like typically there's not really going to be as much ownership thrash throughout the day in baseball like there is in NBA, right? Like, I mean, if a star gets ruled out right before lock, or even not even right before lock, 30 minutes before lock in NBA, it changes the whole slate. It changes the way all these different ownerships come together. Like even the initial run of ownership projections for a baseball slate are probably a lot closer to what they will end up at than in another sport. Like I think this is pretty accurate for the way that the slate's going to play out tonight, right? Like Coors is going to be very popular. I think the Dodgers are also going to be popular. And then you have these kind of like little positional guys, like Trout is always popular, and catcher is a tough position. So when there's an upside catcher, right, that guy shows up in the lineups. But I kind of agree overall, these will continue to dial in, but I agree that it's like Coors and Dodgers tonight on the hitting side was where the chalk will be. So, but yeah, I would say anytime in the final hour before lock, you're probably good to go. Okay. And I don't see any other questions coming in here for today's stream. So it was a good one. Had fun with that one today. We got to talk about some kind of more, I don't know, complicated. I don't know, complicated. I guess some more detailed conversations about ownership fade, but also kind of some more fundamentals of what we're trying to do with our baseball lineups, how to add some of that initial value to SaberSim. Talked a little bit about, you know, how different contest sizing affects things and so forth. We will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, same place. Actually, I should mention that we will be live here tomorrow, but I'm probably going to bring that stream up earlier a little bit. I have another show with one of our partners here right after this stream normally takes place. So we'll probably bump up tomorrow's stream a little bit earlier. So stay tuned for that. Maybe we get started a half hour earlier or so. Good luck on the slate tonight. Good luck in your golf lineups if you played golf here. And we'll be right back again here tomorrow. So take care. Cheers.